Thank you for coming. We'd like to ask you questions and then post a transcript of the conversation. I thought I'd start by asking about human-centered capitalism, which I think I understand the principles, but I'm not less clear on the means to get there. I know you want to measure different things, which might provide different incentives. You want to pay regulators more to even the field. But beyond that, how do you get this major transition to happen?
There's a saying in business that you make what you measure. And that's not just in business, that's in all organizations, and that's human nature. We have a fixation on numbers and goals. And right now, the primary goals we set as an economy and society are oriented around stock market prices, GDP, and to some extent, headline unemployment rate. Those three measures are leading us in very distinct directions that have less and less relationship with how the average American is doing. And one of the things I say on the trail is that corporate profits are at record highs, but also at record highs in the U.S. Stress, anxiety, financial insecurity, student loan indebtedness, mental illness, depression, suicides, drug overdoses. And that life expectancy has declined for the last 3 years. So if your corporate profits are going up and your life expectancy is going down, which do you listen to as a society? So step one is to get the measurements right. Instead of trying to use these crude economic measurements as proxies for our well-being, we should just measure our well-being. So what is our well-being? Health and life expectancy, mental health and freedom from substance abuse, childhood success rates, proportion of Americans who can retire in quality circumstances, environmental sustainability. You could even have variables like civic engagement and artistic and cultural dynamism. So to your question, first you have measurements for these things. And I would suggest that just having these be a primary element of how we pay attention to our own health and progress would be game-changing. Because right now the messages that Americans get are that things are great. You can tell because the stock market's setting new highs and these numbers look very positive and rosy. But then Americans sense that those numbers don't correspond to how their communities are doing. They're seeing that 8 Americans are dying of drug overdoses every hour, that their kids are addicted to either smartphones or drugs. And so that disconnect is causing massive, massive problems. If you actually showed the people that we know that we're in the midst of a mental health crisis, a wellness recession, a civic engagement depression, that would be alone a massive step forward. And also, if you have these measurements, then many, many organizations would naturally try to remedy them. So nonprofits and local governments would look and say, wow, it's incredible that our social measurements are declining this precipitously. We need to do something about it. Now, to your question, how do we actually move things in that direction? This is where, first, your tax system comes in. So right now we have a relatively crude way to reward charitable contributions, which is we say, hey, they're tax deductible. For most businesses, this is helpful, but just about anything they spend money on is quote-unquote tax deductible because it's going to reduce their earnings by a certain amount. So we need to do more to say, look, if you can actually discernibly improve, let's say, graduation rates in a particular town or area, or physical wellness of, let's call it, hundreds and thousands of employees, then not only do you get a tax break for having put money into that, but you might even get something positive in addition for the fact that you actually have improved our society's measurements on the things that we care about. If we persist on following GDP, we're going to follow it off a cliff because things like artificial intelligence and self-driving trucks will be tremendous for both GDP and corporate profits, and they will be very problematic, even disastrous, for many, many Americans. If you can imagine a business or organization that is following the wrong measurements, That is the United States of America right now. Human-centered capitalism actually shows us how we are doing, and then we'll put our country's energies towards improving our lives rather than the bottom lines of a smaller and smaller handful of companies.
So just to follow up on step 2, essentially you're using tax expenditures to reward companies that improve education or health,
Or nonprofits or entrepreneurs.
rather than have the government have policies that improve education or health. I mean,
Of course, the government should be enacting those policies at every turn.
isn't it going to make the tax system fairly complicated? More complicated?
Well, one could argue that right now we have a lot of complication without a lot of the positive value you'd hope to generate from that complication. I guess I'll stop there. So actually, let me continue for a second. So the goal of government should be to improve these measurements at every turn. That's another reason why having them as the core measurements of our economy is so important. Because right now, if you have these surges in deaths of despair, which you do in much of the country, that should be a red flag for us all, particularly for government. What's happening right now is that Americans fear that our government is essentially not accountable to the success or failure of our people. So if you were, let's say, a state government in Ohio, and then you saw these epic surges in opiate deaths to the point that your morgues can't actually accommodate the bodies and they're storing them at local funeral homes, the government looks up at this and says, well, this is a major problem, and then it tries to do something about it, but the people don't feel like anything happens to the government, whether the opiate deaths continue or get better.
But so in a way, it sounds like you want to put dollars behind what the Business Roundtable just talked about, of corporate responsibility, and not just focusing on profits. They got some pushback from people who said, if you're a steel company, what you do best is make steel efficiently and reward your employees fairly for doing that. You're not an expert in graduation rates. And so in a democracy, rather than ask the steel company or the test press each to come up with their own solutions, we ought to tax those companies and then work on graduation rates through the government. But you think that's wrong?
Well, so before I decided to run for president, I spent 7 years running a national nonprofit that I founded called Venture for America. And we did a lot of good, still doing a lot of good today. The organization has grown and prospered after I stepped down. But I saw the limits of what's happening in both government and philanthropy in many respects. It's why the flagship proposal of my campaign is to put $1,000 a month into the hands of every American adult. This would improve graduation rates, health and nutrition, mental health and stress levels, rates of business formation, domestic violence rates. It would decrease hospital visits. Because if you put the resources into the hands of a nonprofit like myself, and I'm very, very proud of all the work that we've done, you have the feeling that you're still just scratching the surface of the problem you're trying to address. Where my organization has helped create about 3,500 jobs and counting over the last number of years. We were honored by the Obama administration multiple times. And I've been to those communities now for 7 years, and I've recognized that my work was like pouring water into a bathtub that has a giant hole ripped in the bottom. The rate of change right now in our society is faster than ever. Technology is transforming our way of life fundamentally. Amazon alone is closing 30% of America's stores and malls, reducing the most common job in our economy, which is retail clerk. And the average retail clerk is a 39-year-old woman making between $8 and $12 an hour. What is her next role when the store or mall closes? Now, one theory of the case would be, well, we should get tax revenue and then do something about that. But of course, Amazon, your corporate parent, paid zero in federal taxes last year.
Can I just say, not our corporate parent. Amazon doesn't own the Washington Post.
You are correct. I apologize.
That's okay.
So Amazon, the trillion-dollar tech company, pays zero in taxes, which sort of weakens this case that, hey, we'll get tax revenue and then make use of it. And the question is, even if the government did have revenue, what would it do for that woman to improve her lot? Right now, that's a very open question. What is the government doing about the fact that 30% of our country's stores and malls are closing for good? What is the government doing about the fact that robot trucks are just now starting to hit the highways, and driving a truck is the most common job in 29 states? And the answer is the government is doing nothing, because our government is decades behind the curve. Everyone knows that. It got rid of the Office of Technology Assessment in 1995, so they've literally been flying blind on technology-related issues for 25 years and counting. The American people know this. So they look up and say, how are we going to actually solve these problems on the ground? That is the open question. That is why Donald Trump is our president today, is because Americans have been unsatisfied with the answer.
So if I could, I'd like to ask a few things about the basic income or the freedom dividend proposal, and starting with the premise, which is that technology is about to, sort of so destabilize the job market and wipe out all these jobs that you're going to have that. I mean, I'm not an expert on trucking, but I spent last night reading about 3 hours about the future of autonomous trucking, and it frankly, it just seems a lot more of a long-range problem than you're describing. I mean, I'm only zeroing in on that because you've emphasized the fact that it's where non-college people get their jobs. And quite apart from doing nothing about it, government is deeply involved as the regulator of transportation, and until the Congress signs off on those trucks, they're not going to hit the road. So I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about why you're so sure that this sort of displacement is not going to work the way it has in the past. For example, even the retail clerks who are being technologically unemployed by Amazon may now be working in one of Amazon's warehouses, just to cite it for instance. So be a little more specific about why that long-range phenomenon whereby technological unemployment kind of corrects itself is not going to happen.
I'm 100% confident because of both what I saw over the last number of years in the markets that have been hit by the automation of manufacturing jobs and the numbers on the ground throughout the country. So first, what many people cite is they say, hey, the United States of America has been through this before with the Industrial Revolution. What they don't seem to remember is that the Industrial Revolution at the turn of the 20th century included mass riots that killed dozens of Americans, caused the equivalent of billions of dollars worth of damage, led to the origination of labor unions that fought for worker rights, Labor Day as a national holiday, and the implementation of universal high school in 1911, in part to try to educate a population that was struggling with the transition, and that our best experts in the field, McKinsey, MIT, the Obama White House, all say that this fourth industrial revolution will affect 2 to 3 times the number of workers on an annual basis than that one did. So even if you were to use history as your template, you'd expect there to be massive problems during this time. The second thing is studying what happened to the 4 million manufacturing workers who lost their jobs primarily in the Midwest over the last number of years. During that time, you did not see those workers get retrained for new jobs. You saw almost half of them drop out of the workforce, and of that group, almost half filed for disability. So there was not the retraining that you hope would occur. And this is with an industry where we actually saw it coming, where we actually had industry oriented retraining programs that were an abysmal failure. It's irresponsible for a politician to talk about turning coal miners into coders, because they will then leave and they will never have to actually train thousands of coal miners to become coders or employ those coders. The retraining programs by the numbers are more of a fantasy than a policy. If right now, in this time of historic change, our labor market were reorganizing, you would not see multi-decade and record low levels of business formation among young people, interstate migration, or other forms of entrepreneurship going off a cliff. We talk about the internet as if it's very, very good for entrepreneurs. It's very, very good for people who want to sell their time for less than subsistence wages online. A couple of generations ago, the entrepreneurship that would have occurred in a community would have been things like a flower shop, a hardware store, a toy store. Now none of those businesses make any sense because the internet has taken those costs down and the opportunities away.
So why is giving everybody $12,000 a year a game changer on this picture?
So if you imagine a town of 10,000 adults in Missouri and they're struggling, and then after I'm president in 2021 and Congress says let's pass the freedom dividend, then the following year they're getting an additional $10 million a month in buying power in that community. Where does the money go? It primarily goes to local businesses, car repairs they've been putting off, daycare expenses.
So hardware stores
Little
and
League
flower
signups,
stores become relevant again?
nonprofits, religious organizations, arts and culture. It goes towards the things that actually make that community function in a healthy way. And it may not be that the hardware store reopens, but you wind up with things like yoga studios and learning centers and things that don't necessarily easily disappear to the cloud.
So
This is one reason why I want to try and repurpose many of the stores and malls that are now closing. Because when retail districts close, or in particular when a mall closes, it causes urban blight for blocks and blocks around. So we have to do our best to try and shift many of these structures to some new productive use that will look different than the use that came before. But if we fail in this, then these communities will likely never recover.